Guys, welcome you all. This is Shakti from Shakti Academy. Please like our video and share. Don't forget to subscribe our channel. Press bell icon so that you could get updated videos of our channel. Right? Hello guys, today we are going to discuss about the kinship, caste and class, right? So this lesson is about the two epic stories, that is nothing but the Brahmins composed the Dharma Shastras, and the next one is the epical critical story of the Mahabharata, right? So why did the historians and the scholars have taken the evidence of these two things is nothing but initially these two things were being composed between 200 BC to 200 CE. So that's what here, what are the things and the cultural religious things have been used by the people, and how did they have lived in the ancient days, and what were their customs and everything we are going to discuss, and especially the family groups, right, like a patrilineal, matrilineal and other family groups we are going to discuss. So that's what here the historians have taken the evidences of this Mahabharata and Dharma Shastra, right? So first one is the concept. So what are the concept being included in the kinship, caste and class is nothing but many rulers in the different practices were followed by the people, and very often families were part of the larger network of the people we define as the relatives. Blood relations can be defined in the many different ways, and Manusmriti, as you know that previously we have discussed in the lesson, that it was considered as one of the most important Dharma Shudra and the Dharma Shastra, which was composed between 200 BC to 200 CE, and these laid the rules and regulation for governing and the social life, and this is nothing but the dividing the four categories, as well as it's giving some of the suggestions to the rulers, especially the caste of the Kshatriya, and giving suggestions like how to administrate the government and other thing. And the next one is, during Mahabharata, the ages, Gotra, were being considered very important by the higher Varna of society, which means the people, those who are considered as the higher caste, they used to adopt their Gotras along with their names, right? So next one is social differences prevail in the integration took place within the framework of the caste system. According to the Shudra, only Kshatriya could be a king, and the original version of Mahabharata is in the Sanskrit language, and it contains a vivid description and battle, forest, palaces and settlements, right? So first one is the finding about the families is nothing but the epic story of the Mahabharata consisting the patrilineal family, as we discussed that many terms of the members, okay, many terms of the numbers of the members were being in the family, but we don't know actually how many members were been in the family, but here many families will have different types of numbers, right? So the relationship within the one another, as well as the kind of activities they used to share their food and other things, and people belong to the same family used to share food and other resources, and live, work together, and they do perform the rituals together. Families are usually part of the larger network of the people defined as relatives. Now we people are telling no relatives, and or use the more technical terms kinfolk, right? So here technical term of the relative was nothing but kinfolk, and while families ties are often regarded as the natural and based on the blood, they are defined as in many ways. Historians have investigate and analyzes attitude towards the family and kinship. So next one is the ideal of a patrilineal. Patrilineal is nothing but which is tracing the descendant from the father to son, grandson and so on. So now we people are following the system of the patrilineal. The same system was followed during the Mahabharatan days, right? So the patrilineal is nothing but father, son, grandson, grandson, okay, which means the descendant of the father's son, okay. So matrilineal is the term used when the descendant is traced through the mother, and the concern with the patrilineal was not unique to ruling families. It's evident that mantras in the ritual text such as the Rig Veda, it is composed that these attitudes were shared by the wealthy men and those who climbed high status, including Brahmins. The next one is critical edition of this Mahabharata, as we discussed that here. Why Mahabharata considered as the critical epic is nothing but since many scholars they began to search about the Mahabharata, the many excavations have been started to find about the history of the Mahabharata, but still it's one of the mystery that it's making us to confusing, and still it's in the one of the mystery one in the Indian history, right? So one of the most ambitious project which was started in 1919 under the leadership of the Indian Sanskritist V.S. Saktankar, and under the leadership of Saktankar a team comprising the dozens of scholars and who started their task of preparing the critical edition of the Mahabharata, and due to that they have collected they have collected 1 lakh verses with the depiction of the wide ranges of the social categories and situation. It was composed over the period about the 1000 years between century 500 BC onwards, and some of the stories contains that may have been circulation even earlier. The central story is about the two sets of a warring cousin that we already knows that is Pandavas, between Pandavas and the Kauravas, and these texts also contain the sections laying down norms and the behaviors for the social groups. This critical edition meant collecting the Sanskrit manuscripts of the text written in the variety of the script and from the different parts of the country. So here the team of Saktangar have started collecting the Sanskrit manuscript and the documents, the text of the Sanskrit and everything they have collected from the different parts of the country, and this team have worked with the methods of the comparing the verses from the each manuscript, and this project under the leadership of V.S. Saktangar have took 47 years to complete their project about the story of Mahabharata, right? So there were several common elements in the Sanskrit versions of the story. Also there were the enormous regional variations in the ways in which the text had been transmitted over the centuries, which reflect complex processes that shaped early social histories. So timeline 2 is nothing but here the two things have major two landmarks have been found in the Mahabharata. First one is between 1919 to 1966, the preparation and the publication of the critical edition of the Mahabharata, which happened between 1919 to 1966. The next one is 1973, V.A.B. Van Buitenen brings English translation of the critical edition, which means here the Buitenen have translated the critical epic of Mahabharata into the English language, and he remaining rest of the things have been completed after his death in 1978. Okay, so next one is the kinship and the marriages. Many rules, so as we know that the many marrying rules were being followed, and the many practices were being followed by the different peoples in the ancient days, as they have mentioned in the Dharma Shastra, which was written by the Brahmin people, right? So families are usually known as the part of the larger network, as we discussed earlier that, and the blood relations are known as a relationship, and here the technical term of the relative is nothing but kinfolk, as we discussed, right? So historians also investigate and analyze attitude towards the family and the kinship. They provide the insight into the people's thinking, and the Mahabharata describes the feud over the land and the power between the two groups of the cousin, as we discussed that the Mahabharata, which is describing about land and power between, okay, the war over the land and power between the two groups of the cousins. The first one is the Kauravas and Pandavas, right? So here we people are getting fighting with our blood relations. No, initially we people are known as the kinfolks, okay, father and fathers, brothers, etc. Especially these fights used to happen for the land. Okay, so here the two groups of the cousins, that thing word, first one is the Kauravas and the next one is the Pandavas, who belonged a single ruling family, and that of the family, okay, the family is known as Kurus. Okay, family is known as Kurus, which is a lineage and the dominating one of the Janapadas. So previously we discussed the 16 Janapadas. Among that, one of the Janapadas were ruled by the family of Kurus. At the end of the Pandavas emerged finally the war between Kauravas and the Pandavas. In this, the Pandavas emerged the victorious. After that, patrilineal section was proclaimed. So while patrilineal had existed prior to the composition of the epic, the central story of Mahabharata reinforced that idea that it was valuable. Under the patrilineal, son could claim the resources, including the throne in the case of the king, of their fathers when they later died, right? So according to the book of the Mahabharata, what it describes about the patrilineal is nothing but the son of the family, okay, can access the resources of the fathers after the death of their fathers. Here the women's, even the daughters of the father, doesn't have any rights to access the resources of the father, right? So next one is the most ruling dynasty between the 16th century onwards claimed to follow the system of the patrilineal, and a variation in the case of the no son. So the concern with the patrilineal was not unique of the ruling families. It is evident that mantras in the ritual texts such as the Rig Veda, it is possible that these attitudes were shared by the wealthy men and those who claimed high status, including Brahmins. Marriage daughters had no claims to the resources of the household, and here they were married into the families outside of the kin. The system was exogamy. So here one more system, marriage system, was shared by the historians, that is known by exogamy. Exogamy is nothing but giving the daughters to out of the kin. Out of the kin is nothing but, as we know that initially the gotras will be there, different gotras will be there. So here the daughters won't be given in the same gotra, since they consider as the sons and brothers. That's what they won't give the girl daughter to within the gotras, and that's what often seeking and giving girls to the outside of their family, that is known as exogamy, right? So women were married at the right time and the right age and the right person. So this is one of the responsible for the father. Okay, this is one of the responsible for the father, and this gave the rise to a belief in that Kanyadana, or the gift of the daughter in the marriage, as an important religious duty of the father. So here the father is responsible for looking the right time for the marriage, and finding the right person for his daughter and other things, right? So the full and full responsible only will depend on the father, since he was considered as the head of the family. So Brahmins laid down the codes of the social behavior in the great detail, and these were meant to be followed by the Brahmins in the particular of the rest of the society in the general. From century 500 BC, these terms were being compiled in the Sanskrit text known as the Dharma Shudras and the Dharma Shastras. The most important such works, the Manusmriti, was compiled between, as we discussed, that though every rules and regulations and even the marriage system and the resources, who can access the resource of the father, and the women wanted to get married outside of the family, that is known by exogamy and paternally, everything have been mentioned by the Brahmins, and they have written all the regulations in their book is a Manusmriti, which means the Dharma Shastra or Dharma Shudra, right? So this Dharma Shastra and the Dharma Shudra recognized as many as 8 forms of the marriage. So here, as you know that here there were 8 forms of the marriage have been recommended by this Dharma Shastra, and of these only 4 were been considered as the good, while the remaining were condemned, right? So out of these 8 were been mentioned in the Dharma Shastra, only 4 out of 8 will be considered as the good, remaining 4 will be considered as condemned, right? So Gotra. Next one is, what is Gotra? Is nothing but from 1000 BC onwards, people, especially the Brahmins, were often classified into the different Gotras, and each Gotra was named after the Vedic seer. Okay, so here nothing but the people, even the women in the family started to adopt their gotra along with their names, right? So here there are 2 important rules for the gotras. First one is, women were expected to give up their father's gotra and adopt that of their husband on marriage, and the members of the same gotra could not marry, right? So as I told you that the 2 important things, right? So first one is, the woman wanted to give up their father's gotra, and she wanted to adopt that of their husband's gotra after the marriage. So initially we know that now we people are adopting their father's name before the marriage, and after the marriage the women are adopting their husband's name after their name, right? So in the such cases, here the women wanted to give up their father's gotra, and when after the marriage, and instead of father's gotra, she wanted to adopt their husband's gotra, right? And the members of the same gotra, and the woman should not marry the members of the same gotra, and these 2 rules were been given important for the rules for the gotra. Next one is, Satavahanas are one of the powerful ruling lineages who ruled over the part of the Western India and the Deccan, and some of the Satavahanas were rulers and the polygynous, right? Satavahana rulers were identified through the matrimonies that of the succession of the throne were generally patrilineal, right? So here actually previously we have discussed about the patrilineal, and the next one is polygynous, which means a matronymics. Okay, so this matronymics is nothing but the finding the descendant from the mother side, and these descendant from the mother sides were being followed by the ruler of Satavahanas, who have ruled between the 2nd century to 2nd BC to 2nd CE, and especially the place of Western India and the Deccan. Are you clear? Yes. So next one is the social differences. So what are the social differences had been laid down in the Dharma Shastra, which was adopted and written by the Brahmins, right? So initially, as we know that here there were the 4 categories, 4 group of caste have been mentioned by the Brahmins in the Dharma Shastra. First one is a Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishyas and Shudras, right? So here there were the occupations also have been allotted for the particular, allotted for the four caste system, that as you know that here the Dharma Shastra and the Dharma Shastra which adopted and the ranked by the Brahmins is nothing but first caste is nothing but Brahmanas. Okay, Brahmanas were ranked first and it was a divinely obtained, which means they wanted to, the duty of the Brahmins is nothing but they wanted to give sacrifice and accept the sacrifice, and they wanted to study Veda and other thing. So next one is Shudras. Okay, so here last one is Shudra, which is often considered as the untouchable and were at the very bottom of an order. The position within the order was supposedly determined by birth. So according to this Dharma Shudra, what it's finally telling that the status of the man will be determined by their birth. This is one of the important things which they have mentioned in the Dharma Shastra, right? What is the status of the man will be determined by birth, right? So this Shastra also contains the rules about the ideal occupation of the four categories of Varnas. So here the first one is, as we discussed, the Brahmins, they were supposed to study and teach the Vedas, right? So the duty of the Brahmins is nothing but they're supposed to study and teach the Vedas. And the next one is Kshatriyas. Kshatriyas were being engaged in the warfare and they wanted to protect the people and they wanted to do the administration practice and the justices and other things. Next one is Vaishyas. They should be engaged in the agricultural pastoralism, traders, weavers and other activities. Here the Shudras, only one occupation have been allotted for the Shudra, that is nothing but the serving for the three higher Varnas, which means that here the Shudras wanted to serve Brahmins, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas, right? So according to the Shastras, only Kshatriya could be the king, but here the social background, if you see the social background, the Mauryan rulers who have ruled over the large empire has been notably debated themselves, and here actually they described the Mauryan as their low origin, right? So here everything cannot be followed as the Kshatriyas which they have mentioned in the Dharma Shastra, but even though some of the Brahmin ruler and the low caste ruler also ruled in the subcontinent, right? So other rulers such as the Shakas who came from the Central Asia were regarded as the Mlechans and barbarians and outsider by Brahmanas. There was another classification called Jati. Okay, so this Jati is nothing but like a Varna system. So here the Jati is nothing but the thing, the caste whichever is not mentioned in the Dharma Shastra except for Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. Except these four, other communities were considered as the Jatis, will be included in the Jatis. So this is how the Jati was also based on the birth, and unlike the Varna, there is no restriction on the number of Jatis, which means number of community, caste, subdivision of the caste are there in the continent. Whenever the Brahminical authorities encountered the new groups which they did not easily fit into the four-old Varna system, they often be classified them as a Jati, right? So Jati which shared common occupation or professions were sometimes organized into the shades or guilds is nothing but sometimes the people occupation also considered as their Jati, right? For example, sometimes you know that the weavers is one of the occupation, but some later the weaver also become the caste, right? So next one is there were the population whose social practices were not influenced by the Brahminical ideas. They were often described as a word uncivilized or even animal-like in Sanskrit texts, and these included the forest dwellers for whom hunting and gathering remained an important means of the subsistence, and categories such as the Nishada, which is Elukya. Okay, Eklavya is supposed to be have belonged, for example, of this, right? So next one is the Brahmanas developed the sharper social divide by classifying the certain social categories like untouchable and based on the certain activities and the performance of the ritual. These included the handling the crops, corpses and the dead animals, and those who performed such tasks designated as the chandals, and the Manasamati laid down the duties for the chandals, right? So those who considered themselves pure and avoiding taking food from those who designated as untouchable. So here the Brahmins and the other three castes were strictly avoiding the getting food from these Shudras, since they were considered as the untouchable, and they often consider themselves the pure, and they usually avoid taking food from those category, right? So beyond the birth resources and the status. So next one is beyond the birth resources and the status is nothing but as we discussed the figures in the ownership of the Dharma Shastra, and according to the Manusmriti, the pattern estate, the paternal estate was divided equally among the son after the death of their parents with a special share to the eldest, right? So the beyond the birth and the resources is nothing but as we discussed that only the male heirs can have the access of their father's resources, but here after the death of the father, the four sons. For example, if the family consisting the four sons, and after the death of the father, they wanted to divide the resources of the father equally into four, with a special share for the eldest son, right? So women could not claim the share of these sources whenever the women were allowed to retain the gift they received during their marriage, that is consisting as a Sridhana, right? So in Tamil language we used to say Sridhanam, right? So in the Sridhana is nothing but the literary word meaning of the word Sridhana is woman's wealth, okay? So previously we have discussed that women doesn't have any rights to access the resources of the father. So that's what here during the marriage the father is used to get the used to give the gift to the daughter, and it is considered as the Sridhana, which means the woman's sale, and this could be inherited by their children and without a husband having any claim on it. Social differences between the men and women were being sharpened because of the difference in access in the resources. Then another criterion for regulating access to the wealth was Varna. Certain tradition developed and critics of the Varna order, and during that Buddhism during the 6th century rejected the idea of the climbing status on the basis of birth. So what we discussed previously about the Dharma Shastra is nothing but it said that the status of the man will be determined by the birth. But in the 6th century the Buddhism was totally rejected the idea, that is the status on the basis of birth, and it also recognized that there were the differences in the society but did not regard these natural or inflexible. Status could also be claimed in the situation where men who were generous were respected, while those who were miserly or simply accumulated wealth for themselves were despised, right? So one area where these values were cherished was ancient Tamilagam, which means ancient Tamilagam there were not such a system which was not followed by the Dharma Shastras of Brahmins, right? So explaining the social differences is nothing but here the Buddhist text also the ideals on the social inequalities, right? So in myth found that text known as Sutta Pitaka, we have discussed in the chapter 2 that the system was suggested originally human beings did not have fully evolved bodily forms, and nor was the world of plants fully developed. All beings lived in an idyllic state of peace and the taking from nature only what they needed for each meal. So the institution of the kinship was based on the human choice and with the taxes as a form of payment for the services rendered by the king. It was near a rigid system because if human beings were responsible for the creation of the system, they could also change in the future, which means many social differences were there in the India, and here the people or whoever they used to mingle with the kinship, they can mingle with their as per their choice, and here they wanted to pay taxes for the king for services rendered by him, and here many creation in the system and the many cultural were being followed by the group of people in the particular groups. So next one is handling text histories and the Mahabharata. So here we are going to know about the Mahabharata and the initial edition of the Mahabharata, right? So here historians consider the several elements when they analyze the text. They examine the language and the kinds of text. So whenever the historian used to find about the text, the first thing is they want to examine the language and what kind of text is it, right? So in the same thing that here, as we know that the the audition and the author who was composed, so initially we know that here the Vyasar, here the Vyasar was the composer of the Mahabharata, right? So but here actually he was not a original composer of Mahabharata. So you know that the dynamic test of the Mahabharata is nothing but the Mahabharata have been considered into the two broad heads. The first one is the sessions that contain the stories and the designated as a narrative, right? So here first one is in the narrative form and the next one is in the didactic form. First one is the narrative form, next one is in the didactic form, and generally historians agree that the Mahabharata was meant to be a dramatic and which moving story, and the didactic portion were been probably added later. Initially, as we know that the Mahabharata was one of the dramatic story, consisting the dramatic story. In the latter, when the people developed and the language developed, that time the people and the authors they have added the didactic portion, which means the narrating the stories, narrating the stories and the social messages in the latter period, right? The original story of Mahabharata was composed by chariot bards. Note down here, the chariot bards is nothing but the person who is charioteer bards is a poet. So charioteer bards known as Sutas, and who generally accompanied Kshatriyas warriors to be battlefield and composed poems. celebrating their victories and other achievements, right? So initially we know that this Mahabharata group of Pandavas and the Kauravas belong from the Kshatriya families, and here the chariot bards poet also belongs from the Kshatriya family who was known as Shutas, and here he wanted to note down the battlefield which was won by the Kshatriyas, and finally with his victories and other achievements he have written the verses of Mahabharata, right? So here, but what we people are telling that this enormous composition of Mahabharata is totally named and attributed to a sage named Vyasa, right? But Vyasa is a later poet who added more Sanskrit words in the Mahabharata, right? But the original composer of a Mahabharata was chariot bards who belong from the Kshatriyan family, right? So the Mahabharata, like a major epic, contains a vivid description about the battle, forest, palaces and the settlement. The growth of Mahabharata did not stop within the Sanskrit vision over the centuries, and it started to write in a different languages, and the variety of the languages were being started to use for the dialogue between the people and the communities and those who have written the text, right? So even though many people in the English and other languages and the historians they started to know about this history, and they are translating into the different languages, right? So here, why did we people are considering this Vyasa were the composer and the writer of the Mahabharata is nothing but once the chariot bards have written the story of Mahabharata, it consisted only the 10,000 verses. Okay, note down, only it consists the 10,000 verses. But here, after that, Vyasa have took the composement of the Mahabharata and he added some of the Sanskrit mantras and other version in the book of Mahabharata, and he made the 10,000 verses into 1 lakh version, as we discussed earlier, right? 10,000 verses to 1 lakh version by using the Sanskrit tradition, Sanskrit languages and other thing. Then that's what here we people are finally telling that this Mahabharata was initially composed in the Sanskrit language, right? Yes, but still so many stories and the many mysteries is happening, like Asvatthama, still he was living in India, but here the people, those who are living in the foothill of Himalayas and other places, they have a thought that Asvatthama still is living, and he used to come twice in a year for the particular fort, okay, particular forts, and here the many medicines have been trying to recover the wound from his body, but still as the Lord Krishna's curse, the wounds won't be cured, and still he is trying to cure his body, but nothing is working to his body, right? So these are the epical stories of Mahabharata, but still we people don't know that whether they started, as we discussed that in 1951 to 52 there were the excavation started in the place of the Hastinapura, okay, place of Hastinapura. But here what happened, here the people found only the houses which was built with clay and bricks and other things, like they haven't found any knife battle, they haven't found any sources which they have held the battle and other things, right? Yes, thank you all, thank you for watching.